The wooden planks groaned under the weight of their carriage wheels as Elizabeth and Thomas crossed into the shadow of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Behind them, the last traces of civilization faded into morning mist. This is the story of how two young dreamers walked into the Appalachian wilderness in 1858 and stepped out of history itself. The scent of wild honeysuckle mingled with the earthy dampness of creek stones, while somewhere in the dense canopy above, a whippoorwill's call echoed like a warning no one heeded. Elizabeth Hartwell had married Thomas Morrison just 3 days earlier in the parlor of her father's house in Beckley, Virginia. The ceremony was small, practical, befitting a union born more of necessity than passion. Thomas needed a wife to help establish his homestead. Elizabeth needed escape from a father whose debts threatened to consume what little remained of their family's respectability. Now, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in these mountains for over a century and a half. Thomas had purchased 40 acres sight unseen from a land speculator in Richmond, paying with money inherited from his grandfather's estate. The deed described property along Blackwater Creek, fertile bottomland, perfect for farming, accessible by the old Cherokee trail that wound through Devil's Backbone Ridge. What the deed didn't mention were the reasons previous settlers had abandoned their claims in that particular hollow. From the Beckley Weekly Register, August 15, 1858. Young couple ventures into Cherokee territory. Local guides refuse passage beyond Horseshoe Bend. The morning of August 17th dawned clear and promising. Elizabeth wore her traveling dress of brown wool, practical boots, and a bonnet that had belonged to her mother. Thomas drove their hired wagon, loaded with supplies for their new life. Farming tools, preserved food, bedding, and the cedar chest that held Elizabeth's few precious possessions. Their horse, a sturdy mare named Molly, picked her way carefully along the narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. The bridge appeared around midday, spanning a gorge where Blackwater Creek carved its path through limestone 60 feet below. The structure was older than anyone remembered, built from hand-hewn timbers that had weathered to silver gray. Local Cherokee had called it the Crossing of Sorrows, though white settlers assumed this referred to the difficulty of the passage rather than any deeper meaning. Thomas examined the bridge carefully before crossing. The planks seemed solid, the supporting beams intact. Elizabeth later told a trader they'd encountered that morning that the bridge felt wrong somehow, but she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way their footsteps echoed hollow beneath them, or how Molly shied and snorted when they reached the center span. But they crossed safely and continued toward their new home. The trader, Silas Murphy, would be the last person to see them alive. He encountered the couple around 2 o'clock that afternoon, 3 miles beyond the bridge. Thomas was walking beside the wagon to ease the load on Molly as they climbed a particularly steep grade. Elizabeth sat primly on the driver's seat, her hands folded in her lap, but Murphy noticed how her eyes darted constantly toward the tree line. "Asked me about the native folk in these parts," Murphy later told investigators. "Whether they were hostile to settlers. Told them the Cherokee had been moved out near 20 years prior, but that didn't seem to ease their minds none." Murphy offered to sell them additional ammunition for Thomas's rifle, but the young man declined, saying they carried sufficient supplies. The trader warned them about traveling after dark, explaining that the trail beyond the next ridge became treacherous in poor light. Thomas assured him they would make camp before sunset. The mountains swallowed them after that. What really waits in wilderness that has tasted blood before? 3 days later, Molly returned to the bridge alone, dragging the empty carriage behind her, the leather traces cut clean through with something sharper than any animal possessed. Molly's hooves struck the wooden planks like funeral drums as she dragged the empty carriage back across the bridge at dawn on August 20th. The mare's flanks were lathered with sweat and something darker that looked suspiciously like dried blood. This discovery would transform a simple missing persons case into the most haunting mystery in Appalachian history. The sound of iron wheels scraping against stone echoed through the gorge, while the acrid smell of fear sweat hung in the morning air, and Molly's breathing came in ragged gasps that spoke of terror rather than exhaustion. James Whitfield, the local blacksmith, had risen early to check his fish traps along Blackwater Creek when he spotted the riderless horse emerging from the mountain trail. The carriage bounced and lurched behind her, its contents scattered and the canvas covering torn to shreds. Whitfield's first instinct was to approach slowly. Molly was not a horse he recognized, but her obvious distress suggested something had gone terribly wrong. As he drew closer, he noticed the leather traces that connected her to the carriage had been severed with surgical precision. No animal made cuts that clean. No accident left edges that sharp. From the Monroe County Sheriff's log, August 20th, 1858. Horse returned without passengers, traces cut through, blood on harness of unknown origin. Investigation commenced immediately. Whitfield led the trembling mare to his stable, then examined the carriage more carefully. Elizabeth's cedar chest had been pried open, its contents strewn across the wagon bed. Her mother's china lay in pieces among scattered clothing and torn papers. Thomas's rifle was missing, along with all their food supplies and farming tools. But strangest of all, their personal belongings remained untouched. Elizabeth's jewelry, including her grandmother's silver locket, lay undisturbed in a small wooden box. Thomas's pocket watch, worth more than most men earned in a month, still ticked steadily from where it had fallen beneath the driver's seat. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford arrived within the hour, accompanied by his deputy and 2 local men experienced in tracking. Crawford was a methodical man who had served as sheriff for 8 years without encountering anything more mysterious than cattle theft and the occasional moonshine operation. The scene before him challenged everything he understood about criminal behavior in these mountains. Bandits take valuables, Crawford noted in his official report. Wild animals don't cut leather with knives, and missing folk don't usually send their horse home with evidence. The tracking party set out immediately, following the trail back toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. The path was easy enough to follow at first. Molly's hoofprints were clear in the soft earth, and the carriage wheels had left deep ruts where Thomas had struggled to navigate the rocky terrain. But 3 miles beyond the bridge, at the exact spot where Silas Murphy had encountered the couple, the trail simply vanished. Not gradually, as if the wagon had turned onto harder ground, not confused by other tracks or obscured by weather. The hoofprints and wheel ruts ended as abruptly as if the carriage had been lifted into the air. Deputy Marshal Frank Hawkins, a man who had tracked Confederate deserters through these same mountains during the war, later described the scene as unnatural in every respect. The ground showed no signs of struggle, no disturbance that might indicate violence. Thomas and Elizabeth had simply ceased to exist at that particular point on the trail. The search expanded over the following days. Local farmers abandoned their harvest preparations to comb through ravines and hidden valleys. Cherokee guides, despite their complicated relationship with white settlers, offered their assistance. Even children were enlisted to check every cave and hollow within a day's walk of the disappearance site. They found nothing. Broken dreams scatter like autumn leaves. But on the fourth day of searching, young Daniel Morse made a discovery that changed everything. The 12-year-old had been exploring a narrow ravine half a mile from the main trail when he spotted something white wedged between two boulders. Elizabeth's bonnet, the one her mother had worn to church every Sunday for 20 years, hung from a thorn bush 60 feet below the trail. The bonnet was torn and stained, but not with mud or from natural weathering. Dark spots on the white fabric suggested blood, and the fabric had been ripped by something with claws. Yet how had it traveled so far from the trail? And why was it the only trace of the missing couple that searchers could find? Sheriff Crawford descended into the ravine himself, hoping to discover additional evidence. Instead, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the limestone beside where the bonnet hung were markings that looked disturbingly like symbols. Not random scratches or natural weathering, but deliberate cuts forming patterns that seemed almost familiar, yet utterly foreign. The Cherokee guides refused to approach the ravine after seeing the markings. When pressed by Crawford, the eldest guide would only say that some places were hungry for strangers and that white men had built their bridge where crossing was forbidden. What had Thomas and Elizabeth encountered in those final moments before vanishing? What force could make experienced mountain dwellers refuse to search further? Crawford ordered the ravine thoroughly searched anyway, but his men found no bodies, no additional clothing, no weapons or tools. Just those strange markings carved into stone and a bonnet that should never have ended up where they found it. As night fell on August 24th, the official search was called off. 2 people had walked into the Appalachian wilderness and disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. But the mountains were about to reveal that some disappearances are only the beginning of the mystery. The official search ended, but the mountains themselves seemed to be conducting their own investigation. Strange lights flickered through the canopy where no campfires should burn, and sounds echoed from Devil's Backbone Ridge that belonged to no creature the locals recognized. What Sheriff Crawford didn't report in his official records would prove more terrifying than anything he documented. The sharp crack of breaking branches carried through the midnight air, while the metallic taste of fear settled on tongues like morning frost, and every footstep seemed to echo twice in the darkness that followed. Word of the couple's disappearance spread through the valley communities faster than wildfire. Settlers who had lived in these mountains for generations began locking their doors at sunset and keeping loaded rifles within arm's reach. The Cherokee warnings about the bridge suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like wisdom ignored at mortal cost. Martha Hensley, who ran the general store in nearby Summersville, noticed the change immediately. Families who normally ventured into the mountains for hunting and gathering began staying close to town. Orders for ammunition doubled, then tripled. Men who had never shown fear of anything started traveling in groups, and even then, only during daylight hours. Folks were spooked proper, she later told a traveling journalist. Not just by what happened to them young marrieds, but by what kept happening after they went missing. The strange occurrences began 3 nights after the search was called off. Eli Patterson, whose farm sat closest to the trail leading toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, reported seeing lights moving through the forest around midnight. Not the steady glow of lanterns or the flickering dance of campfires, but cold, blue-white illumination that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. From the diary of Reverend Joshua Miles, August 27, 1858. Eli Patterson came to me in great distress, claims to have seen unholy lights in the woods, begged me to bless his property. I fear grief over the lost couple has affected his reason. But Patterson wasn't the only witness. Over the following week, Similar reports came from farms scattered throughout the valley. Always the same description: cold lights moving through the trees, visible only between midnight and dawn, following no logical pattern but always centered around the area where Thomas and Elizabeth had vanished. Rebecca Walsh, who lived with her elderly father on a homestead 2 miles from the bridge, provided the most detailed account. She had risen to tend her sick cow when she spotted the lights through her kitchen window. Instead of fleeing, she watched for nearly an hour, trying to understand what she was seeing. They moved like they were searching for something, she told Sheriff Crawford. Up and down the mountainside, stopping here and there like they were examining the ground. But Sheriff, there was something following the lights. Something dark that moved between the trees, always staying just out of the glow. Crawford initially dismissed these reports as hysteria brought on by the mysterious disappearance. Mountain folk were prone to superstition, he reasoned, and tragic events often spawned ghost stories and wild tales. But when his own deputy reported seeing the lights while on patrol, Crawford was forced to reconsider. Deputy Marshal Hawkins had been riding the main trail at 2:30 in the morning when he spotted the blue-white glow moving through the forest above him. Professional curiosity overcoming caution, he dismounted and climbed toward the light source, his service revolver drawn and ready. The hunt continues in silence. What Hawkins found defied rational explanation. A section of forest roughly 50 yards across glowed with that cold, unnatural light, but the illumination seemed to come from the trees themselves rather than any external source. The air within the glowing area felt different, thicker somehow, and carried a scent he couldn't identify, but that made his skin crawl. Most disturbing were the markings. Every tree within the illuminated circle bore fresh cuts carved into the bark. Not random scratches from animal claws, but deliberate symbols that matched the markings found in the ravine where Elizabeth's bonnet had been discovered. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift in the unnatural light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Hawkins tried to copy some of the symbols into his notebook, but his pencil refused to make marks on the paper while he stood within the circle of light. The moment he stepped outside the glow, normal writing resumed, but the symbols he attempted to recreate looked wrong somehow, incomplete, as if something essential had been lost in translation. When Crawford examined Hawkins's report the next morning, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of investigating further or seeking outside assistance, he ordered all official records of the strange lights to be sealed. The disappearance of Thomas and Elizabeth remained an open case, but any mention of supernatural phenomena was suppressed. People were already scared enough, Crawford later explained to his successor. Last thing we needed was panic spreading to other counties. Bad for settlement, bad for business, bad for everyone except the newspapers looking to sell stories about mountain monsters. But sealing official records couldn't stop private investigations. Dr. Marcus Webb, the same physician who had documented other mysterious deaths across the South, arrived in Summersville on September 3rd, drawn by newspaper accounts of the disappearance. Webb had made a career of studying unusual cases, and the combination of vanished newlyweds and supernatural lights proved irresistible. Webb rented a room at Martha Hensley's boarding house and began conducting his own interviews. Unlike Sheriff Crawford, Webb recorded every detail, no matter how fantastic or unbelievable. His methodology was simple: assume nothing, document everything, and let patterns emerge from accumulated evidence. What patterns emerged would challenge everything Webb thought he knew about the natural world. Because the lights weren't just random phenomena, they followed a schedule, appeared in specific locations, and seemed to be searching for something with increasing desperation. The question wasn't what had happened to Thomas and Elizabeth Morrison. The question was what had been waiting for them in those mountains, and why it wasn't finished hunting yet. Webb's investigation would uncover connections stretching back decades, revealing that the bridge crossing wasn't the beginning of the mystery. It was merely the latest chapter in a story that began long before any white settlers had ever set foot in these mountains. Dr. Webb's methodical interviews revealed a pattern that made his medical training seem woefully inadequate for the horror he was documenting. The lights weren't random supernatural phenomena. They were following a systematic search grid, as if something was hunting with scientific precision. What Webb discovered in the county courthouse records would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about Devil's Backbone Ridge. The musty smell of old paper filled Webb's nostrils as he examined deed records by lamplight, while dust motes danced in the golden glow, and his fingers traced property lines that seemed to shift when viewed too closely. The courthouse basement held records dating back to the 1780s, when the first white settlers had attempted to establish claims in these mountains. Webb spent 3 days poring over land grants, property transfers, and most importantly, the notations scrawled in margins by previous county clerks. A pattern emerged that chilled him to the bone. Every 20 years, like clockwork, someone disappeared near that bridge. Not always newlyweds, not always settlers, but always two people traveling together. Always crossing from the civilized side of Devil's Backbone Ridge into the wilderness beyond. From Dr. Webb's private journal, September 8, 1858. Found 17 separate incidents spanning 80 years. Each follows identical pattern. 2 travelers, bridge crossing, mysterious vanishing. Local authorities consistently report insufficient evidence for proper investigation. The earliest recorded disappearance occurred in 1778. Samuel and Margaret Fletcher, a brother and sister traveling west to establish a trading post, had crossed the bridge on August 19th and were never seen again. Their pack horses returned 2 days later, just as Molly had, with cut traces and missing supplies, but valuables left untouched. 20 years later, almost to the day, cousins Benjamin and Jacob Morse vanished under identical circumstances. Then, in 1818, a father and adult son named Harrison disappeared while surveying timber claims. Each incident followed the same impossible script. Successful bridge crossing, mysterious vanishing 3 miles beyond, riderless horses returning with severed traces. Webb's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The local Cherokee had tried to warn white settlers about the bridge for decades, but their warnings were consistently dismissed as attempts to discourage settlement. Treaty negotiations from 1805 contained a specific provision that the Cherokee had requested. The bridge should be destroyed and the crossing forbidden to all travelers. Government officials had refused, calling the request unreasonable superstition that impedes westward expansion. Chief Running Bear, one of the few Cherokee leaders who remained in the area after forced relocation, had left a statement with the Missionary Society that Webb found tucked between property deeds. The translation was crude, but the message was clear. The hungry place takes pairs, always pairs. The old ones who lived in the rocks before Cherokee came, they feast on love turned to fear. Webb initially dismissed this as cultural mythology mixed with understandable resentment over land seizure. But as he continued his research, the 20-year pattern proved unbreakable. Every generation, 2 people in love, or at least traveling together by choice rather than necessity, would cross that bridge and disappear. The mathematics were impossible to ignore. 17 incidents over 80 years, each separated by almost exactly 20 years, each following the identical pattern. The probability of such consistent timing occurring naturally was so remote that Webb's scientific mind refused to accept coincidence as explanation. Something was orchestrating these disappearances. On September 10th, Webb made a decision that would seal his fate. He announced his intention to cross the bridge himself, accompanied by his research assistant, Timothy Marsh. If something was indeed hunting pairs of travelers, Webb reasoned, then it might reveal itself when presented with willing bait. Sheriff Crawford tried to dissuade him, pointing out that a learned physician had more to contribute to society than becoming another mystery for future investigators to puzzle over. But Webb had studied too many unexplained cases to retreat from this one. His professional reputation was built on entering dangerous situations others avoided. Either we discover a natural explanation for these disappearances, Webb told Crawford, or we confirm that forces exist beyond current scientific understanding. Both outcomes advance human knowledge. Crawford's final argument was prophetic. Doctor, what if whatever takes people isn't interested in advancing human knowledge? What if it just wants to keep feeding? Webb dismissed this concern with the confidence of a man who had never encountered anything his education couldn't explain. He spent 2 days preparing for the crossing, gathering scientific instruments to document any unusual phenomena, a barometer to measure atmospheric pressure, a compass to detect magnetic anomalies, thermometers to record temperature fluctuations, and most importantly, a camera to photograph anything extraordinary they might encounter. Timothy Marsh, a 22-year-old medical student from Philadelphia, was less enthusiastic about the expedition, but too devoted to his mentor to refuse participation. Marsh had assisted Webb in investigating other mysterious cases, including the poison murders in Mississippi, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic precision of the Devil's Backbone Ridge disappearances. The ancient hunger stirs again. On the morning of September 13th, Webb and Marsh loaded their supplies into a rented wagon and set out for the bridge. They carried enough provisions for a week-long expedition, assuming they would establish a camp beyond the crossing point and conduct systematic observations of the area where previous travelers had vanished. Martha Hensley watched them depart from her boarding house with obvious dread. "Doctor," she called out as their wagon rolled past her establishment, "whatever you find up there, I pray it finds you first lacking." Webb waved dismissively, confident that scientific method would protect them where superstition had failed others. He had no way of knowing that the lights had been growing brighter each night since his arrival in Summersville, as if something was preparing for their visit. By sunset, they had reached the bridge. Webb set up his instruments while Marsh prepared their evening meal, both men maintaining careful documentation of everything they observed. The barometer showed normal pressure. The compass pointed steadily north. The thermometers recorded typical September temperatures. Everything appeared completely ordinary, which should have been their first warning that nothing about Devil's Backbone Ridge was what it seemed. What waited for them beyond that bridge had been patient for 20 years, but patience was about to end in ways that would make Thomas and Elizabeth's disappearance seem merciful by comparison. Webb's scientific instruments detected nothing unusual as he and Marsh crossed the bridge at first light on September 14th, but the silence that greeted them on the far side was wrong in ways no equipment could measure. Even the insects had stopped making noise. The disappearance pattern was about to reveal its true purpose, and 2 more lives hung in the balance of Webb's academic arrogance. The hollow thud of wooden planks beneath their wagon wheels gave way to the soft crunch of fallen leaves, while the sweet scent of decay mingled with something metallic that neither man could identify, and every surface they touched felt slightly damp despite the clear morning sky. Webb meticulously recorded their progress, noting that they passed the 3-mile mark where previous travelers had vanished at exactly 9:47 a.m. Nothing happened. No mysterious lights, no supernatural phenomena, no sense of impending doom that might explain decades of disappearances. Timothy Marsh began to relax as they continued deeper into the wilderness. Perhaps Dr. Webb's presence had broken whatever pattern governed this place. Perhaps the scientific method would triumph over mountain superstition after all. The young medical student allowed himself to imagine the academic papers they would write, debunking the mysteries of Devil's Backbone Ridge with careful observation and rational analysis. They established their base camp 4 miles beyond the bridge, in a clearing beside a clear-running stream that showed no trace of the mineral staining common to Appalachian waterways. Webb selected the location because it offered excellent visibility in all directions, while providing access to fresh water for their week-long investigation. From Dr. Webb's expedition log, September 14, 1858. No anomalous readings detected. Local terrain appears suitable for agricultural development. Previous disappearances likely result of natural hazards misinterpreted by uneducated witnesses. But as Webb and Marsh set up their camp, they began noticing details that their instruments couldn't quantify. The trees around their clearing grew in perfectly straight lines, as if planted rather than naturally seeded. The stream flowed uphill in several places, defying gravity in ways that hurt to observe directly. Most disturbing, their shadows fell in directions that didn't correspond to the sun's position in the sky. Webb initially attributed these observations to fatigue and nervous excitement. Mountain terrain could create optical illusions, he reasoned, and stress could affect perception in subtle ways. He instructed Marsh to document everything they observed, no matter how strange, but to avoid drawing conclusions until they had gathered sufficient data. The first night passed without incident. Webb and Marsh took turns maintaining watch, recording temperature fluctuations and atmospheric conditions, while keeping careful notes about any unusual phenomena. The stars shone normally. Their campfire burned with ordinary flame, and the night sounds were exactly what experienced outdoorsmen would expect in pristine wilderness. Morning brought their first real indication that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Webb woke to find that his compass now pointed southeast instead of north, not gradually drifting, as might happen near iron deposits, but completely reversed from its reading the previous evening. When he mentioned this to Marsh, the young man checked his own compass and found it pointing due west. Perhaps the magnetic fields in these mountains are more complex than we understood, Webb suggested, though his scientific training rebelled against such easy explanations. Magnetic anomalies didn't typically change overnight, and they certainly didn't affect different instruments in contradictory ways. Marsh made a suggestion that seemed reasonable at the time. They should return to their previous campsite and verify their position using landmarks visible from the bridge. If they had somehow become disoriented during their setup, re-establishing their bearings would resolve the compass problem. Something watches from behind every tree. They packed their instruments and began retracing their path toward the bridge. The trail they had followed the previous day was clearly marked, and they encountered no difficulty following their own wagon ruts back through the forest. But when they reached what should have been the 3-mile point where other travelers had vanished, they found the bridge gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, simply absent. Where ancient timber spans had crossed the gorge for generations, they now faced empty space above rushing water 60 feet below. The road continued to the edge of the chasm, then resumed on the opposite side as if the bridge had never existed. Webb and Marsh stood at the precipice for nearly an hour, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. They had crossed that bridge less than 36 hours earlier. Webb had photographed it extensively, documenting its construction and apparent age. The images were still in his camera, proof that the bridge had existed when they arrived. But proof meant nothing when confronted with the impossible reality of empty air where solid wood should span the gorge. "Doctor," Marsh said slowly, his voice tight with suppressed panic, "how do we get home?" Webb had no answer. According to his maps, this was the only crossing point for 50 miles in either direction. The gorge was too wide to bridge with fallen trees, too deep to ford, too steep to climb down and up the other side. They were effectively trapped in a wilderness that seemed to be changing around them according to rules no scientific training had prepared them to understand. As evening approached, they made a disturbing discovery that explained much about the 20-year pattern of disappearances. Hidden beneath fallen leaves near their campsite, they found remnants of previous camps. Tent stakes driven into ground that should have been undisturbed, fire rings built by hands that had vanished decades earlier, and most chilling of all, carved initials in nearby trees that matched the names of missing travelers. TM and EH August 1858 was carved into an oak tree that had clearly been growing for longer than the few weeks since Thomas and Elizabeth had disappeared. The bark had healed around the letters, indicating years of growth, yet the dates were impossible to reconcile with the tree's apparent age. Webb realized they had discovered the true nature of Devil's Backbone Ridge. This wasn't simply a place where people disappeared. It was a place where time itself functioned according to different rules, where past and present existed simultaneously, where the very concepts of cause and effect had been suspended. But understanding the mystery and escaping it were entirely different challenges. As darkness fell on their second night in the wilderness, Webb and Marsh faced a terrible truth. They had become the latest entries in a pattern that stretched back generations. The question was no longer what had happened to previous travelers. The question was whether anyone would ever solve the mystery of what happened to them. Webb's camera captured something impossible on the morning of September 16th. Their own footprints leading away from camp, photographed while both men slept soundly in their bedrolls. The images showed 4 sets of tracks instead of 2, as if something was mimicking their movements in the darkness. The revelation of what truly hunted in these mountains would challenge every assumption about the nature of predator and prey. The acrid smell of sulfur drifted through the morning mist, while the texture of bark beneath their fingertips felt oddly warm despite the cool mountain air. And somewhere in the distance, a sound like wooden wind chimes played melodies that seemed almost familiar. Webb developed the photographs using chemicals he'd brought for documenting evidence, working by lamplight in their makeshift shelter. What emerged from the developing solution defied rational explanation. The extra footprints weren't random. They formed a perfect mirror image of Webb and Marsh's actual movements, but leading in the opposite direction. When the 2 men had walked east toward their water source, the phantom tracks headed west. When they had circled their camp to gather firewood, the duplicate prints traced the same circle in reverse. Timothy Marsh studied the photographs with growing horror. "Doctor, if something was copying our movements, why didn't we see it? We were awake, alert, taking turns on watch." Webb had no scientific explanation, but a terrible suspicion was forming. The carved initials they'd found weren't just evidence of previous visitors. They were markers left by people who had discovered the same impossible truth, now confronting Webb and Marsh. This place existed outside normal time and space, operating according to rules that predated human understanding. From Dr. Webb's increasingly erratic expedition log, September 16th, 1858. Photographic evidence suggests presence of entities capable of precise mimicry. Hypothesis: we are being studied by intelligence that learns through observation and replication. The photographs revealed additional details that chilled both men to their cores. In several images, shadows fell where no objects existed to cast them. Trees appeared in different positions between consecutive shots taken seconds apart. Most disturbing, the background of one photograph showed two figures sitting by their campfire, even though Webb and Marsh had been standing together examining equipment when the image was captured. The figures in the photograph looked exactly like Webb and Marsh, but their postures were wrong. Too rigid, too symmetrical, like actors who had learned to mimic human behavior without understanding its natural rhythms. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, catching the camera's flash with an intensity that suggested something fundamentally inhuman, looking out through familiar faces. Marsh made a suggestion that revealed how desperately they both wanted to escape. Perhaps they could construct a rope bridge across the gorge using their tent ropes and equipment. The span was narrow enough that a determined climber might reach the opposite side, though the attempt would be extremely dangerous. Webb agreed to the plan, not because he believed it would succeed, but because action felt better than passive acceptance of their situation. They spent the morning fashioning a crude grappling hook from tent stakes and spare metal, testing knots and calculating the physics of their improvised crossing. The hunt grows stronger with each meal. Their first attempt nearly succeeded. Marsh, being younger and more agile, managed to throw their makeshift grapple across the gorge, where it caught securely on a sturdy tree. Testing the rope's strength, they found it would support a man's weight, though barely. Marsh volunteered to make the crossing, reasoning that if he reached the other side, he could secure better anchoring and help Webb follow. He was halfway across when the rope began to change, not fraying or breaking, as might happen with worn equipment under stress. The rope itself was transforming, becoming something organic that moved with muscular contractions. What had been braided hemp now pulsed like a living artery, and Marsh found himself clinging to something that felt disturbingly like human skin. He dropped into the gorge with a scream that echoed off limestone walls for several seconds before ending abruptly. Webb rushed to the edge, expecting to see his assistant's broken body on the rocks below. Instead, he found the stream bed empty, though dark stains on the stones suggested something had recently been there. Marsh's voice called up from the depths. "Doctor, I'm all right. There's a cave down here, and I think I've found where the others went." Webb's relief was short-lived. The voice was definitely Marsh's, but something about the inflection was wrong. The young man had developed a slight southern accent during their weeks in Appalachian communities, but the voice from the gorge spoke with the precise diction of a Philadelphia medical student, as if something was reciting Marsh's words from memory rather than speaking spontaneously. "Timothy, can you climb back up?" Webb called down. "Of course, Doctor. I'm coming up now with something wonderful to show you." The figure that emerged from the gorge looked exactly like Timothy Marsh, but moved with the same unnatural precision Webb had noticed in the phantom photographs. Its clothes were unmarked by the fall, its hair perfectly arranged despite tumbling 60 feet onto jagged rocks. Most disturbing, it carried equipment that had been destroyed in Webb's pack 3 days earlier. "I found them, Doctor," the Marsh thing said, displaying intact scientific instruments that should have been broken glass and twisted metal. "Thomas and Elizabeth and all the others. They're waiting for us in the cave. They have so much to teach us about this place." Webb backed away slowly, his hand finding the revolver he'd brought for protection against wild animals. The thing wearing Marsh's face smiled with perfect teeth that reflected too much light, and spoke in his assistant's voice about discoveries that would revolutionize scientific understanding. But when it moved, Webb caught glimpses of something else beneath the familiar exterior. Something ancient and patient and utterly alien, wearing human faces like masks while it learned to be what it consumed. The real Timothy Marsh was gone, and whatever had taken his place was offering Webb the same choice that had confronted every previous traveler: surrender willingly to the hunger that lived in these mountains, or be consumed by force. Either way, the 20-year cycle would continue, and 2 more names would be carved into trees that grew according to impossible mathematics, in a place where time meant nothing and appetite meant everything. Webb pulled the trigger without hesitation, putting 3 bullets center mass into the thing wearing Timothy Marsh's face. The shots echoed through the gorge like thunder, and the Marsh thing staggered backward, dark fluid spreading across its chest. This moment would reveal the true scope of an intelligence that had been perfecting its craft for longer than human memory could reach. The wet sound of bullets striking flesh mixed with something else entirely, while the iron taste of gunpowder hung in the air like incense. And beneath Webb's fingers, his revolver felt unnaturally cold despite having just been fired repeatedly. The Marsh thing looked down at the spreading stains on its shirt with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than pain or fear. When it raised its head, Timothy's familiar features had shifted slightly, becoming more symmetrical, more perfect, as if the violence had allowed something to drop its careful disguise. "That was unnecessary, Doctor," it said in Marsh's voice, but with an undertone that suggested vast amusement. "I merely wished to show you our collection." Webb reloaded with trembling hands, though he suspected bullets would prove as ineffective as scientific instruments had been in this place. The thing that looked like his assistant smiled with teeth that were too white, too perfectly arranged, too numerous for any human mouth. "You want to see where they went?" it continued, gesturing toward the gorge with movements that flowed like water rather than articulating at joints. "Thomas and Elizabeth, and all the others. They're quite safe, Doctor. Quite preserved. We've learned so much from them about the nature of human bonding." From Dr. Webb's final expedition entry, September 16, 1858. Entity demonstrates complete immunity to physical violence. Hypothesis: we are dealing with something that exists partially outside normal matter. God help us all. The Marsh thing began walking toward the edge of the gorge with steps that left no footprints in the soft earth. Webb followed at a distance, his revolver trained on the creature's back, though he no longer believed conventional weapons could harm something that wore human shapes like clothing. "The bridge appears when pairs approach," the creature explained conversationally. "We've found that love creates the strongest resonance, the clearest signal. Married couples, devoted siblings, close friends bound by genuine affection. The emotional connection acts as a beacon that guides them to us." Webb realized with growing horror that the 20-year cycle wasn't random timing. It was a feeding schedule, carefully maintained to avoid attracting too much attention while ensuring regular nourishment for whatever intelligence lived in these mountains. "What are you?" he demanded, though part of him feared the answer. The Marsh thing turned to face him, and for a moment, its features flickered like a candle flame in wind. Webb glimpsed something beneath the stolen face that belonged in no earthly taxonomy. Angles that hurt to perceive directly, colors that had no names, appendages that existed in too many dimensions for human vision to process completely. "We are what remained when your kind built their settlements on our feeding grounds," it replied. what your Cherokee friends called the hungry ones who lived in the rocks before time began. We adapted, learned to use your bridges, your roads, your eager expansion into territories you didn't understand. The entity revealed something that transformed Webb's understanding of their situation entirely. The bridge didn't just span the gorge, it connected their world to a space that existed parallel to normal reality. A place where the captured pairs were kept alive and aware, studied like specimens in a vast laboratory devoted to understanding human emotion and behavior. Each pair teaches us something new, the creature said, its voice now layering Timothy's speech with dozens of other voices Webb recognized from historical records. The missing Fletcher siblings, the vanished Harrison father and son, Thomas and Elizabeth Morrison, all speaking in unison through the stolen throat of his research assistant. None of them had died. They had been preserved in a state between life and death, their consciousness harvested while their bodies served as research material for an intelligence that viewed human relationships as fascinating puzzles to be solved through direct experimentation. The feeding never truly ends. Webb followed the creature to a section of the gorge where the limestone walls showed carved steps leading down into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, but they descended at angles that violated three-dimensional geometry. Looking down the stairway made Webb's vision blur, and his inner ear rebel against impossible perspectives. "Come, Doctor," the marsh thing invited. "See what we've learned from 80 years of careful study. Your Timothy is quite safe below, adding his voice to our choir of understanding. Soon you'll join him, and together you'll help us comprehend the bond between mentor and student." Webb understood that he faced the same choice that had confronted every traveler who reached this point: descend willingly into whatever hell waited below, or be dragged down by force. Either way, he would become another voice in the collective consciousness that spoke through stolen faces and borrowed memories. But Webb's scientific training had taught him to observe carefully even in extremis. The creature's mimicry was perfect, but not complete. It had perfectly replicated Timothy's appearance and mannerisms, but it spoke about human emotions, like an outsider trying to understand foreign concepts. It had studied love and friendship for decades, without truly comprehending what made those bonds powerful. That gap in understanding might be the only weakness Webb could exploit. If he could somehow turn the creature's curiosity against itself, perhaps there was still a chance to escape the fate that had claimed 17 pairs of travelers over 8 decades. The question was whether a Philadelphia physician possessed the courage and cunning necessary to outwit something that had been perfecting its hunting techniques since before the first white settlers had crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Webb's next decision would determine whether the 20-year cycle continued, or whether someone would finally break the pattern that had fed an ancient hunger for far too long. Webb made a decision that would either save his life or doom him to become another voice in the creature's collection of stolen souls. Instead of fleeing or fighting, he did something the ancient intelligence had never encountered in 80 years of hunting. He offered himself as a willing researcher rather than unwilling prey. This gamble would either break the 20-year cycle forever or add one more brilliant mind to the entity's growing understanding of human nature. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in Webb's ears as he holstered his useless revolver, while the taste of copper fear coated his tongue like pennies, and every breath felt thick with the weight of a decision that would ripple through generations. The marsh thing tilted its head with inhuman precision, studying Webb's sudden change in demeanor with the intensity of a predator analyzing unexpected prey behavior. "You want to understand human bonds," Webb said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. But you're missing the fundamental element that makes those connections powerful. You can replicate our faces, our voices, our mannerisms, but you cannot replicate choice. The creature's stolen features flickered with something that might have been curiosity. For the first time since Timothy's transformation, it seemed genuinely interested in what Webb had to say, rather than simply toying with its food before consumption. Every pair you've taken was forced into your collection, Webb continued, stepping closer to the impossible stairway that led down into darkness. They became specimens because you removed their agency, their ability to choose their fate. But true understanding requires willing participation. From the final entry in Dr. Webb's expedition log, found decades later, if I am to become part of this entity's research, let it be as collaborator rather than victim. Perhaps voluntary sacrifice can teach what forced capture cannot. Webb's proposal was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of being dragged down to join the collective consciousness below, he would descend willingly, maintaining his individual identity while serving as the creature's first truly cooperative research subject. In exchange, the entity would release Timothy Marsh and end its cycle of capturing unwilling victims. Fascinating, the Marsh thing replied, its voice now layered with dozens of previous victims, all speaking in unison. You believe voluntary participation would yield superior data to forced collection, an intriguing hypothesis. The negotiation that followed would have seemed absurd to any outside observer. A 19th century physician bargaining with an ancient intelligence for the lives of people who existed in a space between dimensions. But Webb understood that the creature's fundamental weakness was its inability to comprehend the very emotions it studied. It could mimic love, friendship, and devotion without understanding what made those bonds worth dying for. Webb's offer represented something the entity had never encountered, a research subject who chose cooperation over resistance, who offered partnership instead of struggling against capture. The creature's fascination with this unprecedented behavior ultimately overcame its hunting instincts. The bargain was struck with handshakes that felt like touching ice and electricity simultaneously. Webb would descend into the parallel space where the collected pairs existed, but he would retain his individual consciousness and serve as an interpreter between human experience and alien comprehension. Timothy would be released unharmed, with his memories of the encounter suppressed to prevent dangerous knowledge from spreading to the outside world. Hunger satisfied takes new forms. Timothy Marsh emerged from the impossible stairway 3 hours later, confused and disoriented, but physically unharmed. His last clear memory was of attempting to cross the gorge on their improvised rope bridge. Everything after that existed in his mind as fragmented dreams of underground spaces and voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. He found himself alone at their campsite with a note in Webb's handwriting explaining that the doctor had discovered evidence of a cave system that required immediate exploration. Marsh was instructed to return to Summersville and report that their expedition had found no supernatural phenomena in the Devil's Backbone Ridge area. The bridge reappeared as Marsh prepared to leave, spanning the gorge exactly as it had when they first arrived. His journey back to civilization proceeded without incident, though he would spend the rest of his life troubled by dreams of voices calling his name from underground places he couldn't remember visiting. Sheriff Crawford's final report on the Webb expedition concluded that the doctor had suffered an accidental fall while exploring cave systems beyond the bridge. His body was never recovered, but mountain terrain was notorious for claiming lives and hiding evidence. The case was closed with minimal investigation, but the 20-year cycle of disappearances ended with Webb's sacrifice. No more pairs of travelers vanished near Devil's Backbone Ridge. The strange lights stopped appearing in the forest. Local Cherokee elders quietly acknowledged that the hungry place had finally been satisfied. Dr. Marcus Webb kept his bargain, serving as a bridge between human understanding and alien intelligence in a space that existed outside normal time and geography. Whether his sacrifice brought him peace or eternal torment remains unknown, but his willing cooperation taught the ancient entity something that 80 years of forced collection had failed to provide: the true nature of choice, sacrifice, and love freely given. Timothy Marsh returned to Philadelphia and completed his medical training, though he never practiced in rural areas again. He married, raised children, and lived a long life troubled only by recurring dreams of voices singing in harmony from deep underground. In his final years, he would sometimes mention hearing Dr. Webb's voice among the chorus, but physicians attributed this to age-related cognitive decline. The bridge still stands today, though modern engineers cannot explain how timber construction from the 18th century continues to bear weight without visible signs of decay. And hikers occasionally report hearing voices singing from the gorge below on quiet autumn nights when the mist rolls in thick from the valley. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.